The sun rose slow and heavy over the Arizona mesas, painting the red stone cliffs in molten gold. Dust shimmered in the morning air, the faint sound of cattle lowing from the valley below. It was another dawn over Whispering Mesa Ranch, a land so wide it could swallow a man's heart whole. At the center of it all stood Chaska Red Elk, a man of Apache blood and formidable presence. His ranch sprawled across 20,000 acres of land, rolling grass, narrow canyons, and the blue shimmer of the Salt River cutting through it all like a ribbon of glass. Men called him the wealthy Apache, a title half in respect, half in suspicion. Some said he'd struck gold in the hills. Others whispered he'd taken his wealth from white men who'd wronged his people. The truth, as always, was quieter. Chaska had earned every coin with the sweat of his back and the sharpness of his mind. He'd worked cattle, traded horses, and struck deals with both settlers and tribes. But though he had gold, land, and the strength of a legend, something in his dark eyes spoke of a man who carried more memories than dreams. He was 33, tall and broad-shouldered, with skin bronzed by sun and wind. His black hair hung past his collar, and a faint scar traced from his left cheek to his jaw, a remnant of a knife fight long ago. His voice when he spoke was low, steady, and often laced with a sadness that made people listen closely, even when he said little. The townsfolk of nearby Pueblo Crossing didn't quite know what to make of him. Some respected him, some envied him, and some simply feared the quiet man who owned half the land their cattle grazed on. "That Apache ain't right," old Sam Toller would say at the saloon, swirling his whiskey. "Ain't natural, a red man with money enough to buy a town." But others, especially the women, spoke softer. They said his eyes looked like a storm trying not to break. For all his wealth, Chaska lived alone in his great house at the edge of the mesa. The house itself was a strange thing, half frontier ranch, half Spanish adobe, built with his own hands and those of the few men he trusted. Inside it was clean, vast, and silent, the kind of silence that speaks of ghosts, not peace. It was into that silence that Clara Mayfield arrived one wind-dusted afternoon. She was 22, a girl from Prescott, hired by the housekeeper's letter after the previous maid married and moved away. The coach dropped her at the gate, a thin, sunburned girl with a straw hat and a carpet bag held close to her chest. Her dress was simple, her shoes scuffed, yet there was a certain grace in the way she stood, a steadiness that didn't fit her poor station. She'd lost her parents young, her father a miner who died under rock, her mother taken by fever. Clara had worked in a widow's boarding house since she was 16, cleaning rooms for drifters, traders, and gamblers. She'd learned to keep her eyes down and her hands busy, but when the offer came from Whispering Mesa Ranch, she took it without hesitation. The pay was better, and the open land called to something inside her she didn't understand. When she arrived, the foreman, Tom Vickers, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, greeted her. "You'll find it a quiet place," he said, helping her with her bag. "Mr. Red Elk don't talk much, but he's fair. You do your work well and you'll have no trouble." She nodded, though her heart beat fast. Quiet didn't scare her. Loneliness did. The first time she saw Chaska was that evening. She was carrying linens up the stairs when he stepped out of his study, a glass of whiskey in hand. He paused at the sight of her. His gaze wasn't harsh, but it was sharp enough to still her steps. "You're the new maid," he said, voice low and rough like the hum of thunder. "Yes, sir. Clara Mayfield." He inclined his head slightly. "Welcome to Whispering Mesa. Miss Mayfield." She managed a small curtsy and he turned away, disappearing into his study without another word. That night, she stood at her small window in the servants' quarters, staring out across the vast stretch of land. The wind whispered against the glass, carrying with it the scent of sage and rain. Somewhere out there the cattle lowed, and she thought she heard a lone coyote's call. It was a wild, beautiful place, and she felt both tiny and alive in it. Days turned into weeks. Clara rose before dawn, tending to her chores, sweeping the long halls, dusting the books in the study, polishing the brass fixtures, and preparing tea at noon. She seldom saw her employer except during meals, when he'd sit at the long oak table, half the time lost in thought. He was a man of few words, but never cruel. His voice was soft when he gave instructions, and he never raised it, not even with the ranch hands. Yet there was a distance in him that no one could cross. He carried the air of a man who'd seen too much and spoken too little. Still, Clara began to notice small things about him, How he always watched the horizon at dusk, as if waiting for something. How he kept a small silver locket on his desk, never opening it. How sometimes he would murmur words in Apache, quiet prayers or memories she couldn't understand. One evening, as she brought him supper, she paused at the doorway. The sun was setting through the tall window behind him, casting long orange light across his face. He was writing something, a letter perhaps, but his hand trembled slightly before he stopped altogether, staring at the page. For a moment his expression wasn't that of a proud rancher, but of a man burdened by something unseen. "Is there anything else you'll need, sir?" she asked softly. He looked up, startled, as if he'd forgotten she was there. Then he shook his head. "No. Thank you, Miss Mayfield." Their eyes met just for a second, but something flickered there. Not warmth exactly, but recognition, like two souls that had seen the same kind of sorrow. That night, as she lay in bed, Clara tried to push the thought away. He was her employer. He was a man apart from her world, wealthy, powerful, and Apache in a land that would never forgive her for looking twice at him. And yet, she couldn't stop thinking about the quiet sadness in his eyes. In the days that followed, she found herself humming as she worked, just to fill the silence. Sometimes she caught Chaska listening, standing in the hall with his arms crossed, expression unreadable. Once he surprised her by saying, "My mother used to sing like that." "A song for the sunrise," Clara smiled shyly. "It helps pass the time." He nodded, the corner of his mouth almost turning up. "Then keep singing, Miss Mayfield. The house could use a little life." It was the first kind thing he'd said to her. As the weeks turned into months, the great house no longer felt so empty. She learned his rhythms, the way he preferred his coffee black and his books stacked just so. He in turn learned that she feared thunder but loved the smell of rain. They spoke little, but silence began to lose its weight between them. Sometimes when she dusted the study, he would stand by the window, eyes closed, as if listening to the wind. She'd watch him from the corner of her eye, wondering what storms lay behind that calm. And sometimes, when the dusk light turned the sky red, he would glance at her hands, the ones that worked, scrubbed, and yet held gentleness he hadn't felt in years. The ranch, the wealth, the endless horizon, all of it seemed hollow compared to that fleeting warmth. For the first time in a long while, Chaska Red Elk began to wonder if perhaps beneath all his fortune, he was still a man who could feel, and for Clara Mayfield, who'd come seeking work and nothing more, Whispering Mesa had begun to feel less like a place of loneliness, and more like the beginning of something she didn't yet dare name. The monsoon season came late that year. The air grew heavy with heat, and the scent of rain that never seemed to fall. Days stretched long and still, and the land held its breath, waiting for relief. Clara Mayfield kept to her duties as the sun scorched the horizon, and dust rose like ghost smoke from the dry earth. She'd grown accustomed to the rhythms of the ranch, the creak of saddles in the morning, the clatter of hooves on stone, and the silence that filled the house after sundown. But lately, that silence had begun to shift. Chaska Red Elk had always been a man of restraint, his moods hidden behind the steady mask of calm. But something had changed since that evening when their eyes had met across the lamplight. His gaze lingered now. He'd pass her in the hallway and pause, as if there was something he wanted to say but couldn't bring himself to. And Clara, though she told herself to be cautious, found her thoughts drifting toward him at the oddest hours, when folding linen, when stirring stew, when lying awake listening to the restless wind. One afternoon, while polishing the banister, she caught sight of him outside the window. He was saddling his horse beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, forearms gleaming with sweat. He moved with the ease of a man who belonged to the land itself, strong, deliberate, unhurried. She felt a strange stirring in her chest, the kind that both frightened and thrilled her. He looked up suddenly, catching her gaze through the glass. For one breathless moment, neither looked away. Then with a curt nod, he mounted his horse and rode off toward the northern pastures. That evening, the storm finally came. The sky darkened at dusk, turning greenish and thick. Lightning forked across the mountains, followed by the deep rumble of thunder. By nightfall, rain began to fall in wild, slanting sheets, pelting the windows and filling the air with the scent of wet earth. The ranch hands had long since sought shelter, and Clara was in the kitchen stacking dishes when the door burst open. Wind and rain swept in, followed by the tall figure of Chaska himself. drenched to the bone, hat in hand, boots heavy with mud. He looked more like a ghost than a man, water dripping from his hair onto his shoulders. She froze where she stood, her breath catching at the sight of him. "Mr. Red Elk," she exclaimed, rushing forward. "You're soaked through." He shook his head slightly. "Fence line broke near the river. Had to see to it." His voice was tired, roughened by wind. "Sit, please," she said, fumbling for a towel. "You'll catch your death." "I'm fine." But his hands trembled faintly as he removed his coat. She ignored his protest and stepped closer, wrapping the towel around his shoulders. The nearness between them was electric, his breath uneven, hers quick and shallow. She could feel the heat of him through the damp fabric, smell the rain and dust on his skin. When her fingers brushed the side of his neck, he stiffened, and for a moment, neither moved. His eyes closed, not out of discomfort, but as though surrendering to something long denied. "Forgive me," she whispered, her hands faltering. He didn't open his eyes. "Don't stop," he murmured so softly she barely heard it over the rain. Her hands lingered a moment longer, drying his hair, tracing the line of his jaw. He sat motionless, pretending perhaps that she wasn't really there, or that if he stayed still enough, the world might not punish him for wanting her. When she stepped back, his eyes opened again, dark, unreadable, but full of something deep and quiet that made her heart ache. "You shouldn't wait on me," he said, finally, voice hoarse. "Not like this." "I don't mind," she replied softly. "It's my work." "No," he said. "It's more than that. And we both know it." The words hung between them, heavy as thunderclouds. She wanted to look away, but couldn't. Lightning flashed outside, casting his face in pale light. He looked younger then, almost fragile. Not the proud rancher or the wealthy Apache whispered about in town, but a man who'd forgotten what it meant to be touched without fear or pity. She turned, flustered, pretending to busy herself with the dishes. "I'll bring you some coffee," she said quickly. He didn't stop her. When she returned with the steaming cup, he was sitting by the fire, his shirt clinging to him, his gaze fixed on the flames. She set the cup beside him, but before she could retreat, he spoke. "Do they talk about me in town?" he asked quietly. She hesitated. "Sometimes. And what do they say?" "That you're rich. That you're proud. That you're different." He smiled faintly, but there was no joy in it. "Different," he echoed. "That's a fine word for not belonging anywhere." She looked at him then, not as an employer, but as a man. A man caught between two worlds, carrying the weight of both. "I don't believe what they say," she said. "I only know what I see." "And what do you see, Miss Mayfield?" Her throat tightened. A man who deserves more kindness than he's been given. For a long moment he didn't answer. The rain beat steady against the windows, a rhythm as old as the desert itself. Then he rose, stepping closer until she could feel the warmth of him. "You should be careful saying such things," he murmured. "The world's cruel to women who care for men like me." "I know," she said softly. "But I said it anyway." He stared down at her, and for an instant it seemed he might take her face in his hands, might cross that thin, trembling line between restraint and surrender. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped back, closing his eyes briefly as if to steady himself. "You should rest," he said, voice strained. "It's late." She wanted to argue, to ask what he was running from, but she only nodded, her heart pounding. "Good night, Mr. Red Elk." "Good night, Miss Mayfield." As she walked away, she knew she would never forget the look in his eyes. The quiet, tortured wanting that mirrored her own. That night she lay awake listening to the rain. Every time thunder rolled across the mesa, she thought of him sitting by the fire, his face lit by the glow, pretending sleep while his heart warred with itself. And in his study, Chaska Red Elk did not sleep either. He sat with his head in his hands, feeling the ghost of her touch on his skin. It had been years since anyone had come close enough to touch him, years since he'd allowed it. He told himself it was a mistake, that she was a maid, a fragile thing from another world. But the memory of her hands would not leave him. The warmth of her voice echoed through the empty house long after the storm passed. When he finally closed his eyes, pretending to rest, he shivered, not from the fading cold, but from the unbearable truth that he was no longer untouched by her. For the first time in years, the man they called the wealthy Apache felt something real stir beneath the armor he'd built, and it terrified him. Summer deepened over Whispering Mesa, painting the land in shades of bronze and shadow. The rains had passed, leaving behind a clean scent that clung to the air and the low hum of cicadas that filled the long evenings. Life on the ranch settled back into its rhythm. The men worked the herds. The land breathed again. Yet inside the great house something had shifted, a quiet current moving beneath the surface, unseen but felt in every room. Chaska Red Elk was not the same man he'd been before the storm. He rose earlier now, worked longer, spoke less. The ranch hands whispered that he was restless, haunted perhaps by some private trouble. But only Clara Mayfield knew the truth, or at least part of it. She could feel it in the way he moved around her, careful yet drawn near, as though fighting a pull he could not name. When she brought him his meals, his eyes followed her, unguarded for a moment before he turned away. When she passed him in the hall, he'd tip his hat politely, his voice rougher than usual. And though not a word had been spoken since that night in the storm, both knew something had taken root, something tender, fragile, and frighteningly alive. One evening, just after sunset, Clara stepped out onto the veranda. The air was cool, the last of the day's light bleeding into the horizon, painting it crimson and gold. Below her, the valley lay quiet, dotted with grazing cattle and the far-off bark of a dog. She'd spent the day scrubbing floors and washing linens, her hands raw and her dress clinging to her with the day's heat. Yet standing there under that vast sky, she felt a strange peace. The world was wide and wild, and though she was but one small soul upon it, she belonged to it in some quiet way. She didn't hear him approach until his voice broke the stillness. Couldn't sleep? She turned sharply. Chaska stood at the edge of the veranda, half shadowed by the moonlight. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled, a faint glimmer of sweat still on his throat from work. "No, sir," she said, her voice soft. "It's too quiet tonight." He stepped closer, his boots silent on the wooden boards. "Quiet can be dangerous out here," he murmured. "Makes a man think too much." She smiled faintly. "Or remember too much." He looked at her then. Really looked. "You've got that problem too, Miss Mayfield?" "Sometimes." She hesitated, then added, "You look like a man who carries a lot of memories." Chaska turned toward the horizon, his jaw tightening. "I suppose I do." He paused, his gaze far away. "My mother used to say the desert remembers every footstep, even the ones we'd rather forget." Clara folded her hands. "Did you grow up here?" He nodded slowly. "Born not far from this mesa. My people lived in these canyons long before there was a town, before the railroads, before the soldiers." His tone darkened, just slightly. "When I was a boy they came. Took land, took lives. My father fought and died for what little we had left. I left too. Swore I'd make something the world couldn't take away. Money, land, power." He exhaled, a bitter sound. "Turns out you can build a kingdom and still feel like a beggar." Clara's eyes softened. "You're not a beggar, Mr. Red Elk." He turned toward her, his voice low. "Then why do I feel empty?" The words hung heavy in the air. The only sound was the rustle of wind through the dry grass and the faint call of a night bird. She didn't know what to say. So she did the only thing she could. She stayed, standing beside him in the quiet, watching the moon rise above the mesa, silver and whole. For a long time, neither spoke. Then, without thinking, she said, "My father used to say the world was made of two kinds of people, those who keep fighting and those who give up. I reckon you're one of the first." Chaska smiled faintly, but there was pain in it. "And which are you?" "I thought I was the second," she admitted, "until I came here." He looked at her then, his gaze tracing her face in the moonlight, the curve of her cheek, the glint of courage in her eyes. "You're stronger than you think, Clara." It was the first time he'd spoken her name, her breath caught. She didn't reply, couldn't. The way he said it was too gentle, too personal. The air between them thickened, charged with something wordless. Then came a sound, faint at first, then closer. Coyotes calling from the far ridge, their cries echoing across the canyon like sad music. Chaska tilted his head. "My mother used to say the coyotes sing for the lonely." Clara smiled softly. "Then they've got company tonight." He laughed quietly, and for the first time the sound reached his eyes. It changed him, stripped away the hardness, left only the man beneath. And in that instant, under the wide western sky, something broke loose inside them both. He reached for her hand without thinking, The touch was light, tentative, but it carried the weight of everything they hadn't said. She didn't pull away. His hand was rough, warm, calloused from years of work. Hers was small, worn but gentle. They fit together as if they had always been meant to. When she looked up, his gaze held hers. "Clara," he whispered, her name like a prayer. She swallowed, her voice barely there. "Yes?" "I shouldn't," he said. "But God help me, I can't seem to stop." He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her knuckles. Not bold, but reverent. She felt it in her chest more than her skin. When he released her, she didn't move away. Instead, she whispered, "Maybe some things aren't meant to be stopped." For a long while, they stood in silence. Just a man and a woman alone under the endless sky, the moon casting silver light over the mesa. No more words passed between them that night, but when he finally walked her back to the doorway, the air felt different, alive, heavy with unspoken promise. As she turned to go inside, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch lingered, a feather's weight, but enough to set her trembling. "Good night." "Clara," he said softly. "Good night," she whispered. Long after she'd gone, Chaska remained on the veranda, staring out across the land he'd fought for. The night wind carried her scent, lavender soap and clean linen, and he closed his eyes, feeling the ache of something he'd thought long dead. Love. But love was dangerous. Love was weakness. Love was a fire that burned away the walls he'd built to survive. Still, as he stood there beneath the stars, the sound of her laughter echoing faintly in his memory, he knew the truth. The quiet of Whispering Mesa was no longer the silence of loneliness. It was the breath between heartbeats, the space where something sacred had begun to live, and deep down, though he would never admit it, not even to himself, the wealthy Apache feared the quiet no longer. Because in that quiet, he'd found her. Autumn came early to the mesa that year. The sky grew sharper, the mornings cooler, and the golden light of September stretched long over the land. The cattle grazed fat and lazy, the river ran clear, and for a time, peace seemed to have finally settled over Whispering Mesa Ranch. But peace never lasts long in a land built on pride and old grudges. The world beyond the ranch had begun to take notice of whispers about Chaska Red Elk and his white. Maid. It started small, as it always does. A murmur at the general store, a raised eyebrow at the church. Then came the men who drank too much and talked too loud. Men like Gideon Marr, a rancher with land just south of the mesa and a heart as mean as the desert wind. Marr had hated Chaska for years, hated his success, his wealth, and most of all, his blood. It burned him to see an Apache man own more land, more cattle, and more respect than he ever would. So when word reached him that the Maid and the half-breed were keeping company, he smiled a cruel, thin smile. "Figures," he spat at the saloon one night. "Can't keep their own kind, so they steal ours." By week's end, the whole town had heard. Clara noticed the change first when she went into Pueblo Crossing for supplies. The shopkeeper, who had always been polite, served her in silence. The wives at the mercantile turned away when she passed. Even the preacher's daughter, who used to nod kindly, crossed the street rather than meet her eyes. She told herself it didn't matter. But when she caught sight of her reflection in the window, cheeks flushed, chin trembling, she felt the shame that wasn't hers to bear. When she returned to the ranch, she found Chaska in the corral tending to a restless colt. She hesitated, watching him a moment. The sun caught the lines of his shoulders, the steadiness of his movements. He looked up when he sensed her. "You've been in town," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied. "They're talking." His expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened. "Let them. It's not just talk," she said. "They're saying things about me, about us." He dropped the rope, walking toward her. "Do you believe them?" She shook her head fiercely. "No, but I'm afraid of what they'll do." He stopped before her, close enough that she could see the dust on his collar, smell the faint scent of leather and tobacco. "You have nothing to fear here," he said. "Not while I draw breath." She wanted to believe him. God help her, she did. But that night, as she lay awake, the wind carried the sound of distant riders, and her heart told her peace was ending. 3 nights later, the storm broke. It was near midnight when the dogs began to bark. Clara rose from bed, her pulse hammering. From the window she saw torches flickering along the ridge, a dozen, maybe more, moving toward the ranch house. She ran barefoot down the hall. Chaska was already there, rifle in hand, his expression calm but cold. "Stay inside," he said. "What are you going to do?" "Talk to them." "Talk? They've come for blood." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw the steel beneath his quiet. "If they want blood," he said, "they'll have to spill mine first." She caught his arm. "Please." "Clara," he said softly, and there was such gentleness in his tone that it stilled her. "You've given me something I didn't think I'd ever have again. Don't let them take that from me. Stay inside." And then he was gone, stepping out into the night. The men rode in hard, 15 of them, led by Gideon Marr. They stopped in the yard, faces lit by the glow of torches and hate. Marr dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth. "Well, well," he sneered. "If it ain't the mighty Apache himself guarding what ain't his to keep." Chaska stood silent, the rifle resting easy in his hands. "You've had your say, Marr. Now turn back. Not till you send that whore out here." The words cut the air like a whip. Chaska's voice dropped to a growl. "Watch your tongue, or what?" Marr stepped closer, his hand hovering over his gun. "You'll shoot me, go ahead. We'll see how long you last once the sheriff comes for you." Behind him the men laughed, cruel, drunken laughter that set Clara's teeth on edge as she watched from the window. She couldn't stand it any longer. Throwing open the door, she stepped out into the yard. The wind whipped her hair loose, her white nightdress billowing in the torchlight. The men froze. "Stop this," she cried, her voice shaking but clear. "He's done nothing wrong." Marr sneered. "Go back inside, girl. You don't know what you're doing." "I know he's the only decent man among you," she shot back. A murmur went through the crowd. Marr's face darkened with rage. "You think you're better than us? Living under his roof like some fancy lady? Better than you?" she said, lifting her chin. "I reckon anyone with a soul's better than a coward who hides behind a torch." The men shifted uneasily. The sheriff, who'd come along half drunk, cleared his throat. "That's enough, Gideon. Let's not make this worse." "Worse?" Marr barked. "You see what's right in front of you? This savage has turned her head, and you're just gonna let it stand?" Chaska raised his rifle, not aimed but firm. "You've said your piece," he said. "Now ride home." For a long moment it seemed Marr might draw. His hand twitched near his gun belt. But something in Chaska's stance, the calm steadiness of a man who'd kill if he must, made him hesitate. Finally he spat in the dirt. "This ain't over, Red Elk." Then he turned, mounting his horse. One by one the others followed. The torches faded into the dark. When they were gone, Chaska lowered the rifle. The night was silent again, save for the sound of Clara's sobbing. He turned to her slowly. "You shouldn't have come out." "I had to," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They would have killed you." He stepped closer, his voice softer now. "You risked your life. So did you." They stood there, breathing hard, the night wind curling around them. And then, as if drawn by something greater than reason, he reached for her. His hand brushed her cheek, his thumb catching a tear. "You're trembling," he murmured. "So are you," she said. And then he kissed her. It wasn't a desperate kiss, nor a hurried one, but deep, aching, the kind of kiss that silences every fear and sets the heart free. When they parted, her forehead rested against his chest. He held her as though the world outside might vanish and only they would remain. "I love you," she whispered. "I don't care who knows it." His voice was rough when he answered. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." He laughed once, a low, disbelieving sound, and then kissed her again. Slower this time, tasting the rain on her lips, the courage in her breath. Above them, the stars burned cold and bright, witnesses to a love the world could not bless but could never break. And in that moment, under the vast Arizona night, the man who had once been alone in his wealth and his silence knew that no hate could steal what he'd found. For even in the wild, cruel West, love once kindled burned fiercer than any torch. The night that followed the standoff passed without sleep. The air still smelled of smoke and fear, though the torches had gone out hours ago. Chaska sat by the fire in the main room, his rifle across his knees, staring at the dying embers. Outside, the coyotes cried in the distance, a wild, lonesome sound that seemed to echo what was left in his heart. Clara lay in the next room, pretending to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those riders, the torches, the hate in their faces. But beneath all that memory was something deeper, something softer. The memory of his arms, his kiss, and the quiet vow in his eyes that he would die before he let harm touch her. When dawn came, she rose and found him still there, shoulders heavy, gaze distant. The light poured through the window, brushing his face in gold. "You didn't rest," she said softly. He shook his head. "Couldn't. You think they'll come back? They might. Mar's a snake. He don't strike just once." She crossed to him, her bare feet whispering over the wood floor. "Then we'll face him again, together." He looked up at her, really looked. For a long time he said nothing, then finally sighed. "Clara, the world out there won't forgive us. You saw it last night. To them I'll always be the Indian who forgot his place. And you?" He hesitated. She finished for him. "The fool who loved him." His eyes softened. "No, the one brave enough to." The following days were quiet, too quiet. They went about their work, mending fences, feeding horses, keeping the ranch running. But the air felt different, charged with a stillness that comes before a storm. Word came from town that Mar had been bragging in the saloon, claiming the sheriff was fixing to put the savage in his place. Clara tried to hide her fear, but every time she saw a cloud of dust on the horizon, her stomach tightened. One afternoon, she found Chaska sitting on the ridge overlooking the valley, his horse grazing nearby. He was silent, as he often was when his mind turned to the past. She sat beside him, tucking her skirt beneath her. "You're thinking about them again," she said. He didn't ask who them meant. "My people," he said quietly. "My father was a proud man. He fought the soldiers near Sierra Blanca. My mother was taken by them, brought to the fort as a servant. That's where I was born, between two worlds that never wanted me." He picked up a handful of dust and let it fall through his fingers. "When I built this ranch, I thought I could belong somewhere. Thought money would make them forget my blood. But now I see, it only made them hate me more." Clara reached out, taking his hand. "You belong with me," she said. He turned to her, eyes deep as the canyon below. "And if staying with me means they come after you again, I'll still choose you." Something in her voice, unsteady, fierce, true, undid him. He looked away, blinking against the morning light. "You're braver than most men I've ever known," he said softly. "Maybe braver than me." That night, the rain came. A hard, drumming desert rain that fell like forgiveness on the dust. The world smelled new again, wet earth, sage, and promise. Inside the ranch house, the fire burned low. Clara sat near it, mending a shirt that had torn at the shoulder. She didn't hear him come in at first, not until the floor creaked and she looked up. He was standing there, hat in hand, rain dripping from his coat. "I went into town," he said quietly. Her needle froze mid-air. "Why?" "To see the sheriff. To tell him I ain't hiding." Her heart leapt in her throat, and he smiled faintly. "The sheriff ain't blind. He told Mar to keep his men off my land or spend the rest of the season in jail." Seems not everyone's got hate in their bones. Relief flooded her, so sharp it hurt. "So it's over?" He walked closer, his steps slow, deliberate. "Maybe the fight is. But what happens next, and that's up to us." When he reached her, he set his hat on the table and knelt by her chair. "I can give you land," he said. "A house. A name that'll make men nod their heads when you walk by. But I can't give you a life without whispers." "They'll never stop talking." She cupped his face in her hands. "Then let them talk. As long as they don't take this from us." He looked up at her, and the flicker of the fire caught in his eyes. Dark, shining unguarded. "Clara," he whispered. "I closed my eyes once to pretend sleep, because I didn't think I could ever have something gentle. Then you touched me, and I knew I'd spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of that touch." Her breath hitched, her fingers trembling. "You already are." He leaned in and kissed her hand, slow and reverent. "Then stay. Stay with me here on this land, as my wife." For a moment, time stopped. The fire popped, the rain whispered against the windows. "Yes," she breathed. "God help me, yes." They were married the next Sunday, not in a church, but out under the open sky where the mesa met the river. The preacher from town came, quiet and kind. A few neighbors attended, curious at first, then softened by what they saw. She wore white lace. He wore his old cavalry jacket, cleaned and mended. When they exchanged vows, the wind carried their words across the valley, as if the land itself wanted to remember. After the ceremony, As the guests drifted away, Clara turned to him. "What now?" He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Now we build something they can't tear down." And they did. Seasons passed and the ranch grew. Mar moved away after losing his herd in a flood. The hate that once circled their names faded like smoke on the wind. Children came, dark-eyed, laughing, with her smile and his quiet strength. And the townsfolk who once whispered, learned to greet the Red Elk family with nods and warm hands. By the time the railroad reached Pueblo Crossing, people spoke of Whispering Mesa Ranch as one of the finest in Arizona, and they spoke too of the couple who built it, the Apache rancher and his bride, whose love had defied the harshest odds the West could throw. Years later, when Chaska was an old man, he would sit on the porch at dusk, watching the sun drop behind the ridges. Clara would bring him coffee and sit beside him, their hands still finding each other like they had on that first night. "Do you ever think about that night?" she'd ask softly. He'd smile, lines creasing the corners of his eyes. "Every night. About what you felt?" He'd nod. "You touched me and I shivered. Not from fear, from knowing I'd been asleep my whole life till then." And as the twilight deepened, they'd sit in silence. Two souls who had crossed a world of dust and prejudice to find peace in one another. When the dawn came, painting the mesa in gold, it was said that if you listened close, you could still hear the wind whisper through the cottonwoods, the faint echo of a vow made long ago. Let them talk. We'll build something they can't tear down.